Hey, everybody, welcome to the brave new world of video. I actually really like this idea. I'm surprised that we didn't do it before. Um, and I'm very excited to have this episode of the Drawing Board podcast or video podcast, however, we're going to be demarcating it, as an interview with Lauren, one of our newer analysts who's written, um, in all honesty, I reread it this morning. One of my favorite pieces that we've had on the site in quite a long time, the Outset Island Effect. And I want to go into that in all kinds of different ways. But before we do that, I'm going to toss it over to Aaron, just to sort of set us up for success. So let's
Yeah,
do it,
welcome
Lauren.
everyone. I'm stoked about this. So it's a new year, 2021, 2020's in the rearview mirror. And one of the things that I'm really excited to be diving into today as a new feature on the site is something that will ultimately hopefully have a better name, but we can just call Getting to Know the Analysts for now. I realized that in all of the excitement about diving into the project of thinking very seriously about video games, especially given that the work we do is long form written as opposed to video essays where you can see people or at least hear their voices. The amazing and really exceptional people whom we have working as analysts on the sites can sometimes be lost behind the curtain, and especially because video games are such an experiential medium where to analyze them is in many ways inextricable from what your personal experience with them has been. I found myself thinking that was a real shame, and so we're going to start rectifying it. I figured the best place to start would be with our newest addition to the team, Lauren. So Lauren, we're really excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us, and figure this will just be a good venue for the world to get to know you better and have that context as they explore your work.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, not only on the show, but of course on the team. It's been a blast so far, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
The feeling is totally mutual, as I know you know. Lauren, maybe the best way to start this off for our viewers and listeners and readers might be just to give a little bit of précis on who you are, how you got into video games, what excites you about analyzing them, what brought you here.
Yeah, totally. So I guess where I am right now, maybe not physically, but sort of like stage in life. I'm currently a grad student at Oxford University. Just graduated from Harvard, studying English in May 2020. And I'm now doing a master's degree in history and just submitted the application for the doctorate this morning, actually. So feeling pretty
Oh,
good about that.
Woohoo!
But yeah,
Congratulations.
thank you, thank you. But let's see, as far as my engagement with video games goes, so I actually have my dad, I guess both to thank and blame for getting me into video games. He was one of the early practitioners of Pong and Techno Bowl, so he's been at it from the very beginning, and has sort of kept up playing all sorts of games as the technology has evolved since then. And so growing up, I remember watching him play. Like my favorite game to watch him play was the Lord of the Rings GameCube game. And I was in kindergarten,
yeah.
like watching him take a blade to orcs and all of this fantasy violence, and I was just enthralled. I mean, I was also a huge lover of fantasy fiction all the way growing up, from Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, like this ridiculously long paperback series based on Dungeons and Dragons, Inheritance, like just go through the list. And so as soon as I saw him playing this game, my imagination was just like captivated by this. And my mom would only let me play on weekends though. So video games became a weekend thing where my dad, my sister, and I would kind of get together and all play these RPG fantasy games together. So it started off Lord of the Rings, and then it moved to like Mario 64 was another one, Diddy Kong Racing, and then from there, once we got to the GameCube, the game that really kind of fired me up was Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, which is why I think in the Outside Island piece, you can tell that I am reliving childhood in a lot of parts of it, because that was the game that really started my independent love for games as a mode of storytelling, I guess you could say. And then from there, just kind of grew up playing all different kinds of consoles and different kinds of games. Game Boy, DS, Wii Plus, most recently Switch. But I think favorite titles would have to be Mario Mario Super Sunshine. Oh man, love that one. Mario Galaxy. More recently, some of the Batman games, as far as like Arkham Knight goes, Arkham Origins, and the rest. But I think Zelda has been the kind of mainstay of my video game love, especially as an art form and a as a kind of legendarium in and of itself.
It's funny, Dan, I don't know if you have a similar experience with this, but my first proper console was a GameCube, actually, and I got it with this promotional disc called the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition, which came with it had the Ocarina of Time, it had Majora's Mask, it had the old school, like original Zelda and the sequel, and it had as kind of an addendum the demo for the Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. So I played like those 10 minutes of that game so many times before I actually got to the game. And so by the time I actually bought The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, it felt like this forbidden fruit that I was actually going to get to play the entire game. So you do such an amazing job of capturing that sentiment of this special magical thing in that game in your piece. I love it.
I had a bit of a different sort of upbringing with video games. So I played games, a lot like you, Lauren, just sort of, they were always there. Started with the Game Boy, and Pokemon got me into it, and sort of captivated me in a sense that like it was a story that I hadn't heard or experienced before. And then I had a Game Boy for a long time, but my first console was the PlayStation. And so I got really into like JRPGs and fantasy games. And what's funny to me is that I knew about Zelda, but I didn't play it until like a little bit later when my brother got a GameCube. And then, I had a similar experience where I had the collector's edition. And it was this weird thing, because back then it was like I was at the right age where the internet didn't have like a ton of stuff on it that was accessible like it is now, but also I didn't have the wherewithal to go and like find out all the little things. So when I played Ocarina of Time for the first time, it was sort of like you were describing, like I had found this thing that I hadn't heard about, nobody had told me about really. And it was just this incredible experience, so different from like even Final Fantasy or the other games that I had played. And I think that, I didn't have the same experience with Wind Waker that you did, but that's not to say that when I was reading your article, I didn't think about the music from Ocarina of Time and a lot of different other games that sort of just brought me right back to like, 11 years old, sitting in front of a GameCube and playing it, So, I think that we all seem to come from a place of like, there wasn't a lot of info being thrown our way about what we were doing, but it was just this magical experience that you only sort of began to codify like a few years later. You're like, oh, that was actually something that a lot of people did, and turns out it was a really important thing for all those people. So.
I think that idea of a magical experience is something I'd like to probe you more about, Lauren, because one of the things that really warms my and Dan's heart whenever people mention it to us, for instance, after we talk at a PAX convention, is when they say that in our presentations we expressed something about video gaming that they felt but didn't know how to put into words before. And I think your Outset Island piece so perfectly does that in the way it tracks the phenomenology of one of the most classically magical experiences of video gaming, right? Which is not just the experience of the music, although you obviously do a fantastic job of tracking that, but that moment that you have that great narrative about at the beginning of the piece when you're at the Symphony of the Goddess, where you find yourself thrown back into the memory of this magical world that at once is so distanced from yourself, but at the same time, kind of an essential aspect of your identity by virtue of having grown up with it and it being a story that was so meaningful to you and interactive. So I'd love to hear just a little bit more about how you think about that magical experience in general, but also because, you know, that piece is so clearly a love letter to the Wind Waker, what special meaning the Wind Waker has to you and what inspired you to write about it.
Yeah, totally. So it's interesting. I think what's so cool about games in particular, as opposed to any other mode of storytelling, is just how many media they cross, right? And that is sort of been the running, or that was one of the running themes of the Outset Island piece. And it's interesting just now in conversation, thinking back to the way I first kind of came into games, because it was never, when I was growing up, sort of games as the only magical world to go and explore. And maybe this is because my really first kind of like inkling of what a video game is was coming from the Lord of the Rings, which is at once, right, so much more than just a book or just a movie. It's a kind of myth in and of itself that lives and in the air that we breathe even now in different fantasy, in the fantasy genres, right? So it's a sense in which I was exploring the Legend of Zelda, that world, the Wind Waker, in the video game. But then I was also doing the same kind of like questing when I would go outside and play on my own, or when I was reading all of these different fantasy books. So it was a cross pollination of these same themes of adventure and exploration and navigation, right? And so it felt like it was just kind of adding layers to this general sense of enchantment that I feel like my childhood had. And so a major part of that was the music of the Wind Waker, right? Not only because it's, as I mentioned in the piece, like so closely identified with a lot of the characters and events and places in the game, but also because music is a medium that cross pollinates, right? So you can be listening to the music when you're biking around the neighborhood or when you're studying, and then suddenly the experience in the game, playing the game that you sort of identify even unconsciously with the music, intrudes or colors the experience you have doing something else when you're listening to this. So that was sort of that idea that video games are a medium that you put in conversation with other experiences had always kind of been there, but I didn't really start to put words to it until high school, actually. And when high school, I went to the amazing Symphony of the Goddesses concert, which was one of the sort of ingredients in the stew that eventually became the article. But another one that I was just sort of reflecting about this morning, actually, was a graduation gift that I gave to my best friend in high school. And so we were both on the soccer team, and she would always make fun of me for listening to Zelda music whenever I was studying. So I'd be like on the bus coming back late night from a game, listening to Legend of Zelda dubstep, right? When I really needed to get work done, and she would just skewer me for it. So it's kind of a gag gift for graduation. I made a CD Zelda music for her, and it was from the 25th anniversary symphony collection. If you can remember that CD that came
It's
out
a
with
great
yeah,
soundtrack.
with Skyward Sword, yeah. And so I burned off all those songs for her on the CD, right? You can tell this is high school because I'm talking about CDs. And for the title of each of these, I told her when she should listen to it. So for like the battle theme, I wrote like, oh, whenever you have to get amped for an exam in college, right? Or, you know, whenever you're feeling sad or kind of nostalgic, Zelda's Lullaby. And then the last piece on there, I put the fanfare at the very end of the Wind Waker, which is actually in the epilogue, like like when Link is casting off for the next adventure, right? And so I said, listen to this when you graduate. You know, this idea that you're stepping onto the stage and off the stage and off onto another adventure. And so then a couple of summers later, I found myself thinking back to how that CD that I gave my friend, like who even knows if she listened to it, right? It was kind of a joke, so she probably just like put it in her room somewhere and never touched it. But I think it was an important step in helping me formulate just how we identify musical experiences in the game with experiences that we're having outside the game and what we call reality. And so I started putting these thoughts down actually the summer after my sophomore year in college. And it took me a long time to write the piece. I ended up finishing it just this past summer after my senior year in college. Not necessarily because I had a hard time thinking about it, but because I had so much fun thinking about it, right? Like it was a way of reliving this idea and this experience every time I sat down to write about it. And so the piece just sort of grew in the telling, I guess you could say. And it's fitting in a way because I found myself when I finally went back to kind of polish it off and send it off this past summer, I had to go back and revise some of the experiences that I talk about in the game. Because when I first started writing it, I was thinking about, oh, what does it look like to go from high school to college, right? To like suddenly go from Texas to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and to get amped for an economics midterm. And then when I was revising the piece, I was like, well, I guess at this stage, now I'm moving from college to grad school, right? From Cambridge, Massachusetts to Oxford, UK. And so in a very interesting way, it's kind of a meta reflection on what the piece was actually saying, right? Because this same music is now getting me from, high school graduation into college, from college into grad school. And so it was interesting to see how even
and in fairness, not to cut you off.
No.
But literally taking you across a great sea as well, if
exactly.
I may put that in there.
Right? So it was a neat reflection to sort of think about how, wow, these ideas, the same music in my own life is reflecting exactly what I'm trying to write about in the piece.
I think that's such an interesting and kind of positive reinterpretation of something that people think about a lot of times in terms of the consumption of storytelling, especially stories that we engaged with when we were little, right? Because something that is very common to talk about and to hear people talk about when they're reviewing literature, right, is the idea of, oh, does this story hold up? Right? When it was something that you loved as a kid, you decide to return to it as an adult. Maybe it ends up being just as amazing. Maybe you realize that, you feel like you didn't have great taste in art when you were a kid or whatever, right? But I love this different and positive spin you put on it, I think. And it's one of the reasons that I keep coming back to your piece in the months since we've published it, which is the idea of it's not so much about whether a piece has held up, at least in terms of something like video games, and it's more about how you reinterpret those experiences you had with it as you grow up and reach different stages in your life, right? So I find that so interesting that you were led to re-engage with and almost reinterpret your time with the Wind Waker just by virtue of being at a different moment in your life. Do you feel like that led you to see your original experience with the Wind Waker differently, or to think about where you are now differently? Like, how does that tie into the actual concept of the outside island effect?
Yeah, totally. Ooh, that's super interesting. So I think one of the things that's interesting that you bring up, Aaron, like how that idea of a game not being necessarily static in what it means to you, but rather it's a receptacle of meaning. And the meaning is indeterminate as much as it is indefinite, right? It keeps changing as you add more experiences between you now and you when you originally engaged with that game. And this is hermeneutics, right? Like, as the literary nerd coming in, this is the science of interpretation. And this is why it's so hard to come to a sort of right answer of what any text means. And so I think you can probably tell how I think about video games is very much colored by the way I think about literature. And what counts as a sort of valid interpretation really comes down to the kind of experiences that someone is bringing to whatever work of art, whatever really thing they're trying to get the meaning of. And so all this to say that it's been interesting going off that idea to see how my engagement with the Wind Waker and with video games more broadly has changed since I came to it as a kid. And there is something magical and really, I don't want to say irrecoverable about childhood, but this idea that you can kind of encounter the thing as it is, right? Probably as close as you can ever get to encountering just the thing. And I think that's something that was common in all of our first experiences of games that's increasingly difficult now in particular, when suddenly like it's so hard to sort of experience a world by itself because you're coming at it, with the internet, right? That gives you a million chat rooms, a million forums online, a million reviews, and YouTube video essays about this thing. And so it's hard to sort of just appreciate, well, what am I getting out of this? But I think I had that just by virtue of the time in my life and the time in history when I first sort of encountered the Wind Waker. And since then, as I've been reflecting more and more about, what do video games continue to mean for me, I find it fascinating that I'm starting to think about them as I'm starting to, how do I put this? I'm starting to recognize in myself and in my own thinking and in my own way of approaching the world, sort of mental models that I can trace back, or at least I can tell a plausible story to how they trace back to playing games as a kid, right? So like this is kind of funny, but I think in a lot of ways, like I think about my day, let's just say like everything I have to do today in terms of like main objective and side quests, right? So it's a great way of trying to organize, okay, like, for this term or for this time in grad school, what's the big boss and what are the mini bosses that I need to like get on route to that, right? Or even if you think about the way of connecting with people, or like solving problems. So many times in Zelda in particular, like getting to complete a mini quest or even a main quest comes down to going into Kokiri Forest and talking to the people who are there, right? And sometimes you don't get the clue in red lettering until like the second or third time you start talking to them. And then suddenly you start piecing together the clues. And then you remember something else that happened, a different part of the world where you have to go and talk to that person, maybe help them out with their cuckoo problem. And then you get whatever you need to go back to Kokiri Forest and help someone else out, right? And I think a lot of times I approach getting to know people that way too, right? Like sometimes I'm not sort of aware of how I can help this person or how I can connect this person with someone else until I've gotten to know them. And then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, now I know how to help this person. Sometimes I'll like have an experience where, oh yeah, what they just said, a name or a question or a solution appears in red. Insofar as it's like, oh wow, yeah, I know how to help this person. So all this to say that, how much of this is me just kind of like drawing an interesting connection and how much of it is actually like the way playing games at such a young age actually shape the way I approach the world. I don't know. Like, I don't know if I necessarily have to answer that question, but it's just interesting to think about how, wow, the kind of stories we engage with in whatever medium we do engage with them, especially at that young age, really does make a huge difference in how we sort of approach problems. I think of Oscar Wilde, actually. He would say, I think it was him who said, things are because we see them, right? And what we see and how we see it is influenced by the arts that have influenced us. And I think video games are a particularly acute example of that.
I think.
Go ahead, Dan. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think another sort of interesting facet, like I'm thinking of what you were talking about, where you put the video game template onto real life objectives and things like that, and how that kind of colors your perception of relationships with people, and like, oh, I had to kind of do this to understand this aspect of somebody. I think that for me, something that I've come across quite a lot, especially as we get more analysts and I talk to them and get to know them, I feel that there's a barrier that's broken pretty easily when I have the discussion of, what's your favorite Zelda game, for example, or what's your favorite Final Fantasy? Because if I ask somebody that and they say Ocarina of Time is my favorite, I immediately think, all right, I think I know this person a little bit. I think I know what kind of experiences they had. And I think I know what they find important and what they find emotionally resonant. Likewise, with Wind Waker, that changes a little bit, and I think that I've told this story to Aaron personally, but I don't think I've said it on a podcast. But I remember when I went to college, first week I was there, I was like, Mr. Oh, I think about video games very seriously. And I was talking about Zelda with people, and somebody said, well, what's your favorite? And I said, oh, mine's Ocarina of Time. And they said, mine's Wind Waker. And I said, oh, and at that point, like, I was like, I don't know, like, I guess it's fine. I think, and I had this moment where I was like talking out loud, and I basically made myself understand what Wind Waker was about, where I'm like, yeah, I guess like it's cool that like the idea of, not clinging to the past, but understanding it and, sort of moving beyond it, taking the important stuff. Like, I guess that's cool. And then as I was explaining that, I was like, oh, is that the point of Wind Waker? Oh, okay. And then I was talking to this guy who became one of my good friends at that school. And I was like, oh, and somewhere in my head, looking back on it, it clicked like, oh, I understand this person a little bit and where they're coming from and what they like. So I think that, you had talked earlier about how music sort of escapes the container that it's presented in. Yeah. And I think the same goes particularly with video games for a myriad reasons that we've gone into. But I think that experience also escapes, and the music is part of it, but it's sort of like this shorthand that you get with people, where just as Lord of the Rings would be, right, where you understand what somebody likes, but also the kind of, person they might want to be or think themselves as. I think it comes through very quickly when you start having conversations about what's your favorite X game,
Dan, that's so interesting. I was actually just reading an article not too long ago that was published after a psychological study that was asking what makes people close. Like, what does it take to have two people develop a very tight relationship? And the big takeaway from that article was it really comes down to a shared reality, which is like these two people see the world the same way and have gone into sort of even a new environment, a new world, and learn to make sense of it together. And I think that's exactly what video games do, right? Like at its core, it's a shared experience. And I think it's probably a more potent shared experience than something like a novel or a film would be, just by virtue of how long it takes to work through a game. It's much longer than sitting down for like an hour and a half movie, say. And there's also a sense of challenge, right, that you don't get in any other kind of passive medium, because you die, right, and you get frustrated, and sometimes you have to like work very hard to get through certain sort of checkpoints in the narrative. And it's so interesting that you talk about how games function as a kind of shorthand for a shared reality, because I can't tell you how many friendships I've made from like the Zelda sticker on the back of my laptop, right? And it's great because it's kind of a subtle signal in a way, because it can kind of pass as, okay, yeah, that's artsy to someone who doesn't know, but to someone who's lived the reality, right, who's like shared a bit of that world, they see it and then they'll say, oh, you play Zelda, and then suddenly we're off to the races, right, and we have something shared.
Yep.
It's amazing how many barriers that similar reality crosses.
And I think it, you touched on the shared experience. I think it does have something to do with, I was thinking about this when you had mentioned your CD, and you gave instructions on like when to listen to certain tracks. And I think that what that says to me is like, I know now what those tracks mean to you. Yeah. Because when you've told me when you think you should listen to this, I understand how you view those. And I think that the difference between, say, because, if somebody had like a Beatles sticker on the back of their laptop, I think that there's a connection there, but it's not as strong as that Zelda sticker, because the Beatles sticker, it's almost like, all right, well, we're going to talk about musical tastes, maybe like what we know of certain bands, what songs we like. But that compared to, I see the royal crest on the back of your laptop, I think like, all right, which one does she like best? What am I going to be talking about with her? But at the heart of it, pretty sure she appreciates courage and, this sort of doing what's right and all of this kind of thing. And these great epic stories that always wrap up so succinctly and beautifully. I think that's maybe a deeper connection that you get right at the off than just like, hey, I like Hey Jude too. It's a pretty good song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting, Lauren, that we would dive into this idea of shared experience because, you know, as you know, on the site we focus mostly on just video games as single player experiences, and yet, as you're rightly saying, a lot of the value that we've all derived from these, even in the instances where the game is a single player experience, like The Legend of Zelda, is by virtue of being able to share that experience with another person, right? And I I feel like I don't know if you have more developed thoughts on this, but you know, the next thing I think about after a phenomenology of the experience of a single player going through this game is like, what is the phenomenology of two players sharing that experience together, right? And I just feel like that's so salient now more than ever when, you know, significant dynamics are changing in terms of how like game publishers even make those experiences possible, where 5 or 10 years ago virtually everything would be couch player co-op with people being able to actually sit next to each other and play a game together on the same console. Now we see that moving away to everyone needing their own separate console and being able to play games together but apart, not in the same physical space. Whereas some people, as you're saying, and as I often do, even just with my girlfriend, right, will play through a single player game on the same couch together and have that experience together, maybe just trade off and take turns as to who's playing. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about, you know, how those different phenomenologies of multiplayer experiences can allow people to get to know each other in different ways.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I certainly do think, I mean, gosh, there's so many variables in that kind of question, right? It's, do you know the person ahead of time? Are you starting a relationship sort of in this virtual world? Even the dynamics of like who's the better player, is it a competitive or is it a cooperative game? And I think what might be interesting too is to pick up on something that Dan said, right? Is that then you introduce the complication of the same event, the same sort of, oh gosh, let's say battle or musical experience, meaning different things to different people, right? So Dan, you might have come up with a CD completely different from mine. You know, maybe you listen to the battle theme before you go to bed as a way to calm down, as opposed to like a way of getting for a midterm. I have no idea. So
I'm assured that Ganon is gone. I'm good. I can go to sleep.
So I think that would be an interesting question to ask as we're trying to parse through like what are the sort of complications to this to the phenomenology of games when we introduce multiple players. I think that a really interesting sort of piece of exploring that, or a piece that could explore that, would maybe even be cooperatively written, right? Like maybe you take the same event and you try to show it from two different perspectives.
That's a great idea, Aaron. Bookmark that.
I love that. Well, we have fodder for something else to do now. There's no question about that. Lauren, switching gears a little, or maybe not switching gears, you know, one thing that I find often comes up in discourse about video games is a seeming friction, or at least distinction, between what it is to enjoy and play a video game just for the sake of playing it versus putting on your analytical hat, so to speak, and analyzing it, right? And yet, I feel like in my experience, in the experience of other analysts, and certainly for all you've said, the best video game analysis comes from a place of trying to better understand why you genuinely love a game so much and are passionate about it, right? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or perspective to offer people who might see those as two very distinct things, as to how you adjudicate in your own life the experience of simply playing a game to play it versus analyzing a game.
Yeah, what an interesting question. I think this too speaks to just how unique the kind of game analysis that With a Terrible Fate does, or With a Terrible Fate is, just because, I mean, I can think of two sort of modes. I think that, and this has come up in our conversations before too, Aaron, of like analyzing video games. And one is just the sort of encounter, right, where you're really not worried too much about trying to understand how games fit together as pieces of art or even arguments, right? And then the other is the opposite side of the spectrum, which is like the strict analysis of video games that you would find in something like the Norton Anthology of Literary Theory and Criticism, which I kid you not, I totally read my senior year in college. It was an article by Ian Bogos about video games as rhetorical argument making, and it was actually trying to do a Marxist critique of Animal Crossing, that, you know, dirty capitalist Tom Nook, all he wants you to do is buy more furniture and build a bigger house when your furniture can't fit into it. So all this to say, right, like there are these two poles, and I think as you were mentioning, the arrow, I don't know, when you think about, okay, who's the audience of this kind of academic analysis that really isn't interested so much in trying to enhance the experience of a game, but rather put video games into a discourse about other media, basically literary criticism. I think the most productive way of thinking about it is to ask, what pieces of like the far academic work can we use to then help people, exactly as you said, better understand the game that they're playing. And I think that this is not so foreign to people's experiences as they might think for first blush, right? You read online in all of these different fandoms, different theories about, say, you know, who is Rey's father, if we're going to talk about Star Wars after we just saw like the newer films that came out, or like all of these fan fiction even. I think that people appreciate trying to solve a riddle about a text they really care about, even if they won't sort of go through the effort of solving or even thinking about that riddle themselves. There is a kind of like shiver of pleasure that comes when you make a connection between a kind of like literary illusion in a text, or even like something as simple as going back and watching the Godfather movies and reading that every time you see an orange, you know someone's gonna die, right? Like little pieces of that world that kind of shine a flashlight into the environment and help you come to a bigger understanding of it. I think just the regular gamer, especially who's in love with the game, appreciates. But I think the trick is there has to be some buy-in before you can bring the analysis, i.e. like people are not going to enjoy any kind of analytical argument about a game they don't already care about. So the trick is to sort of, after you already have, or after a person already has an emotional connection to the game, showing how a more analytical argument in tandem with that emotional connection can actually bring some strength to that connection and add a little bit of the head appreciation in addition to the heart appreciation for it.
I love that. And now you contractually have to come with us to a PAX, because this is so much of what I think that you just sort of hit upon something that Aaron and I felt for a long time, but had shown to us over and over again at those conventions with people coming up to us. Aaron mentioned at the top of this chat that one of the things that we get most of the time is, I didn't know how to say what I was feeling until you put it into words. And I certainly felt that way with the Outset Island Effect article that you wrote. And I think that it is sort of like that crucial piece before the analysis begins is that buy-in, as you called it, of like, well, I know that this means something to me. And I think a lot of people, and this isn't a value judgment, a lot of people are content to say, this means a lot to me, you know? And it's the people that say, but why? What does it say about myself, you know, that this particular thing means so much to me? And I think that those are the people that really latch on to the kind of analysis that we like to do. And I think that what it's kenning to is this sort of, this might be too lofty, but I think, Aaron, I feel like you would agree with me on this. Lauren, I'm interested to see, but I think it is sort of like, you know, well, there's a piece of myself that I want to understand, because I'm engaging in this as a role-playing exercise at the end of the day, you know, playing through this game and going through this experience, so that when I arrive at the end of it and it makes me feel a certain way, the introspection that I do is sort of like, why did this affect me in this way? Which is why I think one of the biggest backlashes that we get, all critics get, all analysts get, is, hey, dummy, that's not what it's about, because I didn't have that feeling when I played it, you know? And I think that the step beyond that is like, no, you're almost there. We're on the same page. We're saying the same thing. I'm just telling you what I thought and what I felt. And it turns out we can learn from each other if we talk about what we both felt and thought. So I think that that's why, to sort of put a coat on my ramblings, I think that your article is so perfect at capturing a feeling that I have when I think about why I engage in this kind of analysis. Is, you know, that Proust didn't just care about the Madeleines. It was everything around it and how he was feeling about it, right? And I think that that's something that, I don't know, maybe is easily overlooked or easily forgotten when we're talking about the games that we really like, but it's such an important part of it. And it's why I think that I like doing this thing that we do. So I wanted to thank you, because that article was just spectacular. And I read it when we published it, but I think then, you know, my life happened and I had forgotten a little bit. So reading it this morning to get hyped for this conversation was a great pleasure. So I wanted to thank you again.
Well, gosh, Dan, thank you. What you just said was so like, oh my gosh, a light bulb just turned on. When you were talking about how really video games they can be, right? If people will go the extra step of introspection, they can be a mode of self-discovery, exactly as you said, because we leave traces, right? In everything we do, if we really enjoy doing it, and even if we don't enjoy doing it, or what we make, how we spend our times, sort of, it clues us in to what we value and how, or who we want to be and how we see ourselves. And I think a lot of times we don't really come to a clear understanding of that until we look backwards and see all that we've done and try to draw the line of best fit through that. And so it's just interesting to think about when we try to picture or consider what role that this kind of analysis that tries to sort of position itself between analysis and storytelling, between the head and the heart, what it can do is it can really help people take that extra step of introspection and ask exactly as you said, like, how does my playing this game and enjoying this game, how does that reflect on something that I find valuable, or a way that I see myself, or the way that I see the world? And I couldn't help but think also when you gave me the contract to come to the next PAX conference, which I'm signing right now.
Yes. It's binding.
Yes. When you said that, you know, people are really looking for an articulation of what this means, and they know it when they see it, right? And they feel it, more importantly, when they read it. I couldn't help but think of Percy Bysshe Shelley and the Defense of Poetry, right, where he talks about the poet as the articulator, as someone who has sort of felt what his readers or what her readers feel, and then just find the words to reflect that back to them. And I don't want to call us like the poets of video games or anything, but I think like that's the role that this kind of analysis can do. And
I also think, just to interrupt you and speak on your behalf, one of the many great things about the outside island effect is that it is, and I know I've told you this before, a poetic mode of analysis in exactly that way. I mean, it so nicely melds narrative and experience in the way that poetry does with a new lens of understanding. I think a great datum for your own benefit about that, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who did this, was after I read that article that you shared, I was encouraged to go back and listen to the Wind Waker soundtrack again, and to kind of tie together what we were saying about co-op with this idea of analysis. It's almost like analytical co-op, right? In the sense that what you provided as a new analytical perspective was not something that threatened my own experience with the Wind Waker. Quite to the contrary, I was eager to go back and re-engage that new experience, or that old experience rather, but exactly as you said, potentially discover something new about myself by virtue of now having this new poetic lens through which to think about it, which is just awesome.
Yeah, and I think that comes from a kind of narrative mode of argument, right? Because I think the difference between something like literature and philosophy is valence, right? You read something philosophical and it's univalent. You're meant to come away with one idea, one argument, one conclusion, right? And you read something like literature, you read a story like in Search of Lost Time, or you experience a story like The Wind Waker, and it's multivalent. You can come away with it with so many different things. And that's where I think the dialogue between art and experience comes into play. And that's how you're able to have like this one piece, this one narrative become a meeting place of sorts for people of all different kinds of experiences to come together and suddenly have a connection they otherwise wouldn't have had.
Lauren, I know we could keep talking about this for hours, but I also know we need to be
I'd rather like
time,
to, frankly.
I know, and I would too. So I think before we move on from that, merely shows that we need to have more of these, which is good data in and of itself. But as a way of wrapping this one up, and to ask you just a few more questions to round out who you are as a person and analyst, Lauren, you are a Renaissance woman in many regards. One thing you haven't mentioned on this podcast is that you are a pilot amongst all other things. And as you said before, you're studying intellectual history. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about those other interests and whether or not you see them as interactive with your interests in video games.
Totally, yeah. So interestingly enough, gosh, this could go so many ways. So I'll just pick out one thread. I think one way that my academic interests and my aviation interests have sort of come together and intersected with video games is through navigation. And I've been thinking a lot about navigation recently, partially because in my flight training last summer, I'm currently an FAA private pilot. I was training in a Cessna 172, and as part of the training, you have to learn how to navigate without your iPad, right? And generally speaking, you have this awesome app called ForeFlight that's basically Google Maps for pilots, and it tells you just follow the magenta line, right? And you don't really have to worry too much about what's happening outside of that magenta line on the moving map on the iPad. But as part of the training, to become a pilot, you have to put away the iPad and learn how to dead reckon, like navigate by just reference to what's outside or reference to an old-fashioned paper map. And so that brings up all sorts of interesting sort of questions about, well, what does it mean to actually orientate oneself in space? And to like think about all these different ways of representing reality and our place in it, from the paper map to what I see outside to the moving map, and how do I reconcile these two images of reality? And so that's kind of one piece of navigation that I've been thinking about. And I also think about it a lot because I love running. And I have to kind of find a new route or a new variation of a route every morning, else it just kind of like gets to be kind of a boring routine. So I've also been thinking about, okay, what does it mean to sort of reconcile the image of a place I see on something like Google Maps to the way I see it in kind of lived experience, lived reality? And so I recently picked up a book called Wayfinding that is basically kind of combination of neuroscience and psychology and adventure story about this journalist who goes to the Arctic, who goes to Australia, and who goes to basically the South Pacific to try to understand how humans navigate without things like Google Maps or ForeFlight in this case. And the author, M.R. O'Connor, talks a lot about what it means to reconcile a kind of allocentric vision of reality. Allo meaning like what we see from above, like a bird's eye view, something we see on Google Maps, to an egocentric kind of view of reality, which is the way we experience, say, a first-person shooter game, right? Or it's just like us living in the environment. And so what does it mean to bounce back and forth? And what kind of areas of our brain develop gray matter as we're doing this? Turns out it's the hippocampus, right? It's this place of our mind or of our brains that encodes memory. And that shrinks whenever we just kind of depend on a GPS to get us places. And that grows whenever we have to suddenly navigate or dead reckon outside of those technological aids. And so the author goes around to like the Inuit in the Arctic and all of these indigenous people in Australia and tries to understand what are the stories that these people tell and identified with the landscape that helps them navigate these places without technological aids. And so there's a sense in which like the myths that become intertwined in the landscape sort of re-enchant the reality and the nature around them in a way that helps these people move through space without something like Google Maps. So all of this to say, it's kind of interesting to think about, okay, wow, so storytelling in a way, the kind of mapping of memory and narrative on physical places actually helps us not only think about these places as something more than just empty space, but also helps us reconcile a kind of allocentric and egocentric vision of reality. So I'm thinking about this because my academic interests are all about sort of the broad narrative of disenchantment that happens post-Enlightenment and has sort of carried all the way through what we think of as modernity and now post-modernity, right? Currently working through Charles Taylor's Secular Age, and we'll probably get to a second Secular Age by the time I actually finish this 800-page tome. But he talks a lot about how once we separated ourselves from the environment, right? Like once technology turned us toward a more kind of instrumental approach to nature, and even distanced us from having to deal with the natural environment, suddenly we come to this idea of like mastery of the environment. And suddenly around us, things start to lose that magical enchantment, right? That a lot of these indigenous people in Australia and Inuits in the Arctic use to navigate, to move through space. So sorry for this turning into a lecture, but where I think video games kind of come to a very interesting way of interjecting into this conversation is, what does it mean to move through virtual space, right? So I'm thinking in particular about Breath of the Wild. And I think you can see how this sort of deflects from the Outset Island piece, which is about sort of identifying place with music. But insofar as when we're playing a video game, we're reconciling these two ways of being, right? Of seeing the world, from the allocentric map to the egocentric experience of playing as the avatar. And as we're moving through the world, different pieces of the world light up. And as we're exploring, we can go back to the map and watch the map grow. And not only that, but what does it look like to try to discover the stories and the music that are hiding in all of these places, right? Is this a way of sort of reorienting our relationship to the nature as we encounter it virtually? And to what extent does that kind of thinking translate to the way we move through space or think about space outside of the game? I think there are at least two interesting threads to kind of pull on here. One is, how can video games sort of come between the allocentric and the egocentric ways of thinking about space? When we suddenly switch the view to seeing the avatar playing in front of us, almost like a puppet, right? It's somehow stationed in between these two modes that we don't really have an option of finding that middle space outside of the video game. So there's a question of, how does that impact our relationship with navigation and with space more broadly? And I think the second thread to pull on of this whole sort of group or cluster constellation of questions is, to what extent can we re-enchant the reality around us and the way we relate to nature, the way we relate to each other through like moving through these virtual environments? And to what extent does it help us appreciate even the aesthetics of nature in a way that we couldn't have before, when we see something as breathtaking as the landscape in Breath of the Wild, right? And so there's a fascinating paradox of like, how can a machine, i.e. something like the Nintendo Switch or the Xbox or the PlayStation, get us as far as might be possible in the modern age from mechanistic thinking? And so I think through that one kind of topic of space, you can see how the interests from aviation to running to academics to video games, kind of, you can draw a through line. And that just kind of gets back to, Dan, your point about, it's only through introspection can you kind of realize what are really the driving values behind all the things that I've done.
I can certainly see the through line, and I also love that answer, because my last question to you was going to be what you were thinking of analyzing next, but you've clearly already answered that, and I love it.
Yeah, well, I have a few other operating ideas. much shorter. One of them is a rage piece against Mario Party. And philosophical determinism. The second, I would say, is like loss of innocence, particularly around the character of Zelda, moving from older Legend of Zelda games to Breath of the Wild. And then the third one, which I think you guys might find interesting, is a peek inside the mind of a speedrunner. And how does our relationship to a video game storyline change when we go from just playing the regular narrative, right, to suddenly trying to like work through any glitches or cheats possible to shorten it as much as possible? And I think this is actually coming from a controversy in the speedrunning world that happened around the Ocarina of Time, actually.
Oh man.
Yeah, so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but someone found a glitch that takes you like midway through the credits. So like straight from the Fury Forest, right, all the way to the end. So there's a question, does that count?
Does that count? Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like, okay, well, what does it mean then to work through the entirety of a narrative? Does it mean that there are certain critical junctures that you have to play? There's not really any rule around that. It's unwritten, right? So what is the minimum viable narrative for a video game, right? And how can we think about that question through like the psychology of speed running?
I love the other question that raises, which is like, how arbitrary are we going to get before we make the argument that it's like it's all arbitrary? So like that, like I figured it would have been at the and we gotta, Aaron, we should rope Matt McGill in on this. But the as soon as you start saying, all right, well, any percent runs, you know, that's like, oh, well, that, all right, so then how are we making the rules here for us? But no, I love that idea. That Ocarina of Time thing, my younger brother brought that up to me, and he was like frothing at the mouth at how ridiculous the whole situation was.
Lauren, it's so cosmically satisfying to me that you would mention that as an idea, because as Dan alluded to, one of our other analysts is actually a PhD candidate at Harvard's neuroscience program, and he actually interviewed a speedrunner to get inside their minds about the experience of speedrunning. So you're in good company, and I have literature to send you.
I do want to, because I will pontificate on this if I don't shut myself up, but I think that just hearing you talk very engagingly about navigation, I think that there's also something to be said about, you know, speed running and this idea of like, where does that magenta line that you mentioned come into it, you know, where it's like, where's the loop around where it's like, I know this game so well, I know every nook and cranny of it, that I don't even go to in any of those nooks or crannies, and I just bypass all of them, right? I think that's, I would be really interested to read something like that from you. So let me know when it's on its way.
Well, Lauren, I know we're over time here. Thank you for being so generous with your time. Were there any parting thoughts that you wanted to leave us and your audience with before we wrap up here?
Huge thank you. Are you kidding? And I'm excited for the next time we get to do this.
Oh my gosh, well, right back at you. This has been an absolute pleasure. I think it speaks volumes to exactly the point I was making at the beginning, that we have such a wonderful team, and you're certainly the ruling rule rather than any exception in that regard. So thank you for being so generous with your time. I hope that if anyone's watching this and they haven't read your Outset Island piece yet, they do so immediately, because it's amazing. And I think I speak for all of us when I say we can't wait to see what you analyze next.
Well, thank you guys. It's been an absolute pleasure. And Happy New Year. My gosh. Go for it.
Yes.
Game.
Likewise. Happy New Year, and go forth and game. Cheers to that.